issues around biodiesel. And I can't think of a better story than a highly personal story. And I just happened to have a great one. So March of 2001, I was up on Mount Baker with my kids, having a ski trip with the kids. And so I'm up on the mountain and I'm getting ready to go skiing. And I get an interesting little voicemail, which I've kept, which I can, does it kind of come up? If it comes up, I'll play it. But in on that day, March 1st, 2012, I got a message from my wife saying, "Honey, we're being raided." And so obviously I called her back. And she said, "Well, there's people here from Homeland Security, the FBI, EPA, border enforcement," because we're close to the border. And they've come with a subpoena. They've got guns, they've got badges. I've let them in, and they're taking everything. And about an hour later, I get a call from Jenny, our business manager. She said, "Atul, we're being raided. There's agents here from Homeland Security, EPA, so on and so forth. They've got guns, they've got badges." And about an hour later, I guess the lead federal agent says, "Yeah, Mr. Deshmane, we want to talk to you, and let's see if we can. We hear you're up on the mountain skiing, and we want to get a hold of you." And I said, "Well, I really can't just come down. I'm with my kids, and we're in the middle of things, and I'll be glad to meet with you as soon as I'll be down in a day." I think I was like if we could look it up. I think March 1st was a Friday, 2012. So I think I was planning to ski the weekend and then come home on Sunday. And it's kind of a tradition. There's a lodge up there. It's really hard to get into, so I wasn't going to just leave. So on Sunday, I think I'm driving home with our van and coming down the mountain. And lo and behold, I see like 8 unmarked federal police vehicles racing up the mountain. And I'm just looking and I'm thinking, okay, what do I tell my kids if they turn around? I'm not going to flag them. Obviously, I'm going home. So that was March 2nd or March 3rd. So it's been 2012 was a challenging year. At the beginning, on April 1st, 2012, we were notified by folks at the federal government that our business manager might be embezzling money from our company. And so we began investigating that. And so by the end of April, I knew I was under federal investigation. I was personally named as a potential criminal suspect. So I had to get attorneys for myself, and obviously you have to get good attorneys. If you get attorneys, there's one thing you do really need to get good attorneys. For myself, for the company, for Jenny, even though she may have actually committed a crime against the company, I had to get a attorney for her. And even though we had an insurance policy that was supposed to cover these kinds of things, we had to get an attorney to go after the insurance company because they were denying service. So, and finding out that you're out $500,000. It was a tough period. And when I went to this conference last year, obviously I didn't talk about it because it was too too much in the middle of it to talk about it, you know. So, but I feel like the issue of regulations and all that is something that I have a little right to talk about. You know, I feel like I'm seasoned now, and so the experience was obviously a difficult one, and you know, obviously there's a big emotional side to that kind of an experience, and a rational. It's rational to be upset by that. But I guess I had the choice, two things of saying, well, to hell with it. It's not worth it. You know, I'll go do something else. And I thought, well, what else will I do? You know, all of my retirement is tied up in this company. And I've gotten a lot of other people to put their money into this company. It's my whole career has been environmental, alternative fuels and environmental vehicles. That's all I've done. So how am I going to try to either attack the EPA, you know, mano on mano, or run away from a world where things like this happen to people all the time? So, I mean, it was a difficult process, and particularly because on May, I think it was May 2nd, I don't remember if it was May 1st, May 2nd, we actually had a meeting scheduled with Lisa Jackson, who was the administrator of the EPA, to talk to her about some of the projects that we want her to be aware of specifically and get specific support for. That didn't have to do with biodiesel, it had to do with renewable natural gas, which now is a live project. But it was kind of hard to be talking to the head of the organization that, you know, tells your wife you're a criminal, and then at the same time still be a proponent. But I guess my story is that regulations are created with a positive, overall positive intention to protect the public good. They're almost never written correctly. They're almost never enforced correctly, and the agencies that are responsible for that don't really take ownership of their own regulations. They don't own the consequences of good and bad decisions associated with those regulations. So we're kind of stuck with, that's the way the world is. That's true in agriculture. That's true with the environment. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have regulations, in my opinion. It just means that in this world, you got to be a little tough. If you want to do something, you got to be a little bit tough and be able to take a few punches. So today, I'm going to talk about the regulatory environment for biodiesel, what kind of regulatory compliance responsibilities a biodiesel producer has, or in many cases, a distributor has to deal with. So I've just summarized a list of them here, and so we'll just talk through them. The first one, of course, the one that related to my story, is the Renewable Fuel Standard. And the reason it's called RFS 2 is there was a regional renewable fuel standard, and the rules were largely rewritten, revised, with the same basic intent, but with a whole lot more of administrative responsibility for renewable fuels producer, with the intention of preventing fraud. It remains to be seen whether it has been, whether that is happened, meaning the additional burden on people who are producers, whether the additional requirements have reduced fraud. There's different opinions, but in general, the majority of people think so. The most severe violations of the renewable fuel standard, at least so far, have been under the original standard, where the generation of RINs was not properly tracked, and there was no checks and balances in the generation of RINs. Let me first start off by asking everybody, who here is familiar with the renewable fuel standard? Okay, so it's worth it for me to go back and go to some basics about the renewable fuel standard. Basically, the central element of the Renewable Fuel Standard is what's called a RIN. And RINs have value. RINs are generated when product is produced and is produced in compliance with domestic standards. In the United States, that's ASTM has a standard. Also, another requirement for RINs to be validly produced is that it has to be produced from qualifying feedstock. You can't make biodiesel from anything, any triglyceride, or fats and oils. You have to make it from specific ones that the EPA has approved. And there's even a change, the kind of feedstock even affects the kind of RIN. For example, there are some feedstocks that are eligible for a D6 RIN, which historically has been a lower value RIN. Today it's not so much. It's very similar in value to the traditional biodiesel RIN, which is a D4 RIN. That's, in addition to that, there's many feedstock that are not even accepted as eligible under the Renewable Fuel Standard. For example, Whole Energy was doing a lot of production tolling with a feedstock called camelina. We were the leader in the nation in 2006. We had about 1 million gallons of camelina oil toll processed that was grown in Montana primarily, crushed in Washington State, and processed in Canada. But when RFS 2 came out, they didn't list camelina as an eligible feedstock. So basically, it instantly shut down the camelina industry as in terms of its demand.
Did it ever get reapproved?
Just a few months ago. But it took it several years later, so it kind of decimated an industry that was emerging. And particularly, it was disappointing because camelina is a dryland crop that it can actually operate and it could be produced with sufficient yields with less than 8 inches of water annual rainfall, which is quite low. Even land that's too dry to sustain dryland wheat can actually be brought into wheat production because camelina, like other brassica, stores and helps the soil store moisture, so it can help bring wheat rotations back to increase the tolerance of a particular plot of land to dryness. The thing that is also important about RFS 2 and RINs is not just generation, it's the practices of how RINs are passed and then eventually monetized. Because none of us are big oil, I'll just focus on the primary pathway that would be relevant to people who are biodiesel producers, and that is how you get paid for them. There's 2 ways that you get paid for the value of RINs. That if you are EPA registered under the RFS 2, you can sell your product and keep the RINs what's considered attached. And that's the default, meaning that you sell a customer, let's say me, 1,000 gallons, and with that 1,000 gallons, the EPA says you get 1.5 RIN per gallon. You would sell me the 1,000 gallons, the truck would ship 1,000 gallons, and in addition to that, I would get a piece of paper documentation saying you also now possess a tool, 1,500 RINs. And that the record keeping of that would go through a special software that EPA has created, where in that software, that 1,500 RINs would be transferred from their account to my account. And so now I would get this 1,000 gallons of 1,500 RINs attached. The other way, and I would pay you a price for that biodiesel with RINs attached, which included the value of those RINs. So, for example, today, I got it up here. Friday. Let's see. So Friday, I've got it a little bit more easy to read here. Okay, Friday, RINs, B4 RINs, here, this category here, biodiesel RINs, we're selling for, and this is 2013 we're talking about. The only line you need to worry about is 2013 year, and that's approximately 94 cents. Those numbers tend to be a little bit high, but I would say low 90 cents. Sorry, go ahead.
Is this like a subsidy, or what is a?
No, I'll walk right through it. That 90 cents times 1.5, which is $1.35, would be represented as a value in the product price. I would be paying more than $1.35 because I'm also getting the underlying biodiesel too. Now, the other way that the product could be transacted is you would sell the biodiesel and you would have a basis for separation, that an EPA approved basis for separation, which would allow you to sell just the biodiesel without the RIN, and then sell the RIN to an obligated party, typically via a broker. And the EPA valid basis of separation of RINs, there's a lot of technical jargon around it, but the main point is that you have to blend the biodiesel to its final blend prior to use. Which means that if the end use of that 1,000 gallons was to go into a biodiesel fueling station that had, let's say, a 5,000 gallon delivery, where that biodiesel was being blended with 4,000 gallons of conventional diesel and being used as a B20 for a B20 pump, then you, as the producer, would be able to separate that RIN if you actually underwent the blending of that biodiesel from what it originated as down to the 20%. Because having to do with blending is not a step that most producers want to have to undertake. It's kind of a role that Whole Energy has fallen into. We typically are the ones who do a lot of separation of RINs. We will even separate RINs for producers, meaning we'll do a valid blend and then we will return those RINs back to the producer and essentially allow them to transact the RINs themselves. Or we might, in cases, also transact those RINs. Typically, because there's so many small producers out there, the best thing to do with small producers for them to be able to aggregate their RINs in enough quantity that then they can get a more realistic value for those RINs and not suffer such a penalty for the value of those RINs relative to big name producers.
What's happening with B99.9 when producers are basically saying we're taking away, we're removing the RINs and it's now blended to 0.99999? What's happening? There are some people in the market selling biodiesel as B99 biodiesel without RINs, and we may price reduce accordingly. Without the blender's credit, price reduced accordingly. And I didn't get into that, but it is possible for an obligated party to separate at will. So if some of the way along the chain of custody, that biodiesel was sold as to an obligated party, and if the obligated party had ownership of that product, then they are allowed to separate RINs at will and then resell that product at will. So obligated parties have special rights in this system, or big petroleum refiners or importers of diesel have special rights in the renewable fuel standard in that they are allowed to separate RINs at will. But the biodiesel manufacturer, producer themselves, being able to...
Can't do that.
Huh?
A biodiesel manufacturer himself cannot do that under the renewable fuel standard. You can't separate unless you have a eligible blending separation event.
Do you have your B99.9?
Yeah. For example,
a producer cannot sell B99. A producer of biodiesel cannot sell, as I understand it, under the Renewable Fuel Standard, B99.9 without RINs, without, as I currently understand it. There are a few producers that are owned by big oil companies, and they could do it, by the way.
So if I have my own biodiesel station, I make the fuel, I get it blended,
If you blend it, then you can, yeah,
blend it.
to its
and I-
final blend.
Right,
I-
then I could actually sell it to the end user.
Mhm.
Now I have RINs to sell.
Right.
So my company, we sell V99 to end users, separate the RINs, and how we do it is our customer has to sign a document saying no, end user customer, no further blending will occur. And we've been through this with the EPA, and they
So
accept
it
that.
is the final blend. That
Yeah.
in that case, the B99 is the final blend. I should have clarified that. That's a very good point. Another extension of,
The final blend.
And then you can't separate the RIN.
well,
And you
it's
can't separate the RIN.
yeah. And by the way, what is a final blend is it should just be clear to you all understand that the final blend rule is perhaps impossible to track and enforce, and the reason is because what it essentially is saying that if you have a B20 pump, okay, and your last fill was diesel, then you just changed the blend. So that was technically a violation of the EPA Renewable Fuel Standard. Of course, the EPA doesn't intend for each of those events to be considered. I'm not the EPA, but I'm bold enough to say that the EPA doesn't intend that when that blend is changed in that instance, that is a violation of the Renewable Fuel Standard. But in their language, that would be a strictest Wahhabist interpretation of the Renewable Fuel Standard would call that a violation.
Quick question on the sheet. The top chart for the top section, the SME,
Yeah.
is that with the RIN or with the RIN stripped out?
That's a B100 price. So bulk biodiesel today is selling for about $5. B100 from big producers.
With the RIN or just the underlying?
With the RIN.
commodity? Okay.
And with RIN values at around 90, and Opus always posts RINs high. I don't know why, but I can try. So $5 minus $1.35 is something 65, 365 minus $1 is 265. So that kind of gives you a feel of 265. Rack diesel around the U.S. is around 3. So that brings biodiesel at a discount to diesel, and people take their margins. And so, that's why it's not that difficult to sell biodiesel this year.
Could you clarify, when you talk about an obligated party, who that is and
What makes you incur an obligation is that you either produce petroleum diesel in this country, or you import petroleum diesel into this country. For example, the refinery complex in India is supplying a huge amount of diesel to the the coastal states.
Jamnagar?
Huh?
Jamnagar, Reliance?
Reliance, yeah. And so, for example, a lot of the Tesoro refineries are not running these days. They've turned into terminals. So.
Just to dive into a little more before you move on. So the RINs, when we generate them, the obligated parties that have to buy the RINs, what's their obligation to buy them under the EPA? And has it always been
The
that way?
EPA sets a threshold for how many RINs in category, and what matters to biodiesel people are D4s and D5s.
Okay.
Now D6 has mattered a little bit too, but I'm just going to narrow it. But there are these categories. The D6 category, I'll just go through real quick. The D6 category used to be primarily fed by ethanol. The D5 category is called advanced. Biodiesel qualifies in the advanced category, but also Brazilian ethanol qualifies in D5, and it's not really Brazilian ethanol. It's not that it's sexier, and although it probably is. But it's sugarcane, and sugarcane has a better energy balance than corn. And as a result, it qualifies as an advanced. D4 is primarily biodiesel, but also the other talk going on right now, renewable diesel is a D4. And then D3 is a cellulosic, and I don't remember what the other, I think D7 is also a cellulosic. I don't know about what's a D1 and a D2.
So why are they required to buy the RINs? That's what I meant, the obligated parties.
They are. Why did the
Yeah,
federal
why
government
is-
make them
yeah.
obligated?
Yeah, to buy these RINs.
Because that was a way to force a certain amount of renewable fuel to be in correspondence with a certain amount of petroleum. By anchoring the amount of renewable fuel to the amount of petroleum, it created a situation where, well, big boys, if you want to continue to sell diesel in America, you've got to pay the piper, and the piper is you've got to help pay for the adoption of renewable fuels.
To demand a market for alternative fuels.
To help the market get created.
Is that what the RIN is?
The renewable.
The RIN is a
identification
method
rules.
of keeping track of those renewable fuel gallons.
Gotcha.
It's just like Rex and a bunch of.
And the reason the rules have become elaborate because there's a concern over fraud in the system.
And that is.
The
where does that
potential,
occur?
the biggest single potential case of fraud would be a situation where a producer would create RINs without actually creating certified product. Certified product meaning appropriate feedstocks, appropriate spec, appropriate registration, maintenance, maintaining your registration. So that would be the primary concern there. It is, depending on who you talk to at EPA, it is also a serious concern about separation not going according to the rules. To date, there have been no, that I am aware of, enforcement actions related to improper separation activities. But I'm sure that I'm sure that there will be, at some point. But it's just a lower priority because it's not like you're making money out of thin air. If you're just, could you imagine if we had anybody had a RFS registration and then, the hell with making biodiesel, it's too much work. Just make RINs and sell us
Well,
RINs.
couple
What a
of
wonderful way to
good-
make money. Unfortunately, that's not allowed. So,
Been done.
yeah, there's a lot of high-profile things that have happened in that regard, obviously that's not beneficial to the system for that to happen.
So what do you see the future of the RIN market over the next few years? Where do you see it going?
I think that RINs will continue to have, since one thing I do know is that RINs will continue to have a seasonality. As obligated parties meet their obligations, then the demand will go down, and then the prices correspondingly will go down. I think that it will be if it remains, if the renewable fuel standard remains, which obviously the biodiesel industry for the most part is pretty much unanimously in support of maintaining it, despite its weaknesses. Typical, you would expect that RINs will rise when consumption isn't high enough, because then there's not enough RINs available to meet the obligations of the obligated parties. So it'll be kind of an equilibrating type of influence. The problem is that between producers and the obligated parties, there's a fertile ground for speculators. And speculators make money on uncertainty and instability in markets, not on stability in markets. So, for example, the Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanleys all have big trading desks that try to manipulate the value of RINs. That's how they make money, is not by having them being rock solid and stable. They make money by things being unstable and uncertain. And so we see wild swings. Unfortunately, that gives ammunition to those in Congress who want to repeal it. So repeal the standards and that mechanism.
So hemp wouldn't be allowed to be made into biodiesel, or would that only
Okay, you can do what you want as far as making it into a biodiesel, but it's not RFS registered.
So does that mean
The only
it doesn't
exception would be if
come
hemp was refined, used in a restaurant application, and then it would be considered used cooking oil.
with- Okay, so would it not be qualified for a RIN then?
Yes, it would not be qualified for a RIN, yeah.
Okay, but you still could sell it on the market?
Yeah,
Okay,
It
gotcha.
would cost $1.35 more a gallon essentially than anything else.
unless you bought it for less.
Or grew it?
For example, we did do a little bit of camelina business, and that was, while all this chaos was happening, this in between period, we negotiated with a few suppliers if they wanted to grow it, that we would play the bisector between the UCO price for yellow grease and the soybean unrefined soybean oil price. So it kind of still made sense in certain cases to do that. So, but the camelina, we didn't get planted for the most part because that's not a very attractive price for camelina growth. So I'm going to go on to I won't spend as much time talking about the LCFS because it's specific to a particular state or a couple of states or a state and a province. Okay. The state is California and the province is British Columbia. And there's an effort to get something like an LCFS adopted in other states around the country. The difference between the primary difference between the LCFS and the RFS is that RFS is volumetric. You get a certain number of RINs per gallon, and a gallon is a unit of volume. The LCFS is carbon focused. So it places a much greater value in terms of the credit value on biodiesel made from recycled materials as opposed to biodiesel made from soybean oil. So, for example, right now in California, the LCFS values, these are also a little bit high. I'm going to use 60 because I actually forward contracted for the quarter we're in at 60. $60 per metric ton, which I'll do the math for you. For a recycled oil gallon is approximately 60 cents per gallon. For a soybean oil gallon, it's about a quarter of that. It's about 15 cents a gallon. And yeah, go ahead.
Can that be generated outside of the state of California, transferred into it?
You have to be registered in the state of California's system.
So physically in California, registered in California system
Yeah.
as a generator?
Right.
Okay.
Don't you generate yours outside of California?
Who?
You.
Okay, so Whole Energy, remember, is first and foremost a distribution company. So we buy, for as it relates to the California low carbon fuels, we buy biodiesel in California from California plants.
Okay.
New Leaf, Blue Sky, Community Fuels. But it's dramatically reduced our purchasing from Community Fuels because they have a primarily soybean oil based product. So it's a more expensive feedstock, but a lower credit value. So California is now running almost exclusively on recycled oil biodiesel because of that, which is, I would say, is not a bad thing. This is having a positive influence in that direction. So we also import. We're also registered as an importer into California. It's expensive to truck fuel, but guess what? If you can truck it into California for 35 cents from Portland, well, that's what you'll do, because I'm getting 60 cents for it.
How are you paid out on that?
Quarterly, so it's kind of painful. Because RINs you can monetize typically within a month, whereas LCFS credits you're waiting at least 3 months. I did forward contract because I want to know what my risk is. I don't want to be at the end of 3 months and have the market collapse to $20 a metric ton and have to eat all that. Because some of my customers want it with LCFS credits attached. Mostly people who want to buy fuel don't want a regulatory hassle. It's, last year I did that how do you buy biodiesel cartoon illustration. I don't know if any of you recall seeing it. It's on. We can do it during the conference. Maybe show it at some point. It's hilarious. You have to see it. It's one of the funniest cartoons you've ever seen, and from someone who's an insider in the biodiesel industry, because it makes it so clear what a nightmare it is for regulatory compliance with biodiesel.
Can you talk a little bit about the ceilings for RFS and LCFS, if there are ceilings, for the number of credits that are available?
Yes, there are ceilings, yeah. So one of the ways that that problem is ameliorated, the concern would be, we hit our ceiling and bang, all the plants in America shut off. Yeah, that would be bad. So compliance overlaps. And actually EPA has extended the overlap even more. So compliance for this year will actually go through to June of 2014. So that's one of the ways that is engineered out of the system. There's a British Columbia low carbon fuels standard. It's a much younger system. They share some of the carbon accounting so that it makes it easier administratively for them to go through and calculate what they think is the carbon intensity of different types of raw material turning into finished product. There's lots of debate whether the carbon accounting is correct. I don't plan to go into that, but it's valid concerns over how carbon is accounted for in those systems. Small players are not don't participate in British Columbia's low carbon fuel standard. It's basically just the three majors that control the BC market, which is Chevron, Esso, which is Exxon, and I'm forgetting somebody. Shell, thanks. This question over here?
No.
Okay.
I had a question on it. So if I make biodiesel and I'm relatively very close to California,
Yeah, you should get LCFS registered. No
so I
brainer.
should get registered because
Yeah.
I've never even heard about the program.
Oh, you should be on the program.
And
it's
then
really
I can sell just as long as I sell my fuel
compliance
to
with
California.
LCFS. Okay, I plan to go into more detail on compliance if we have time.
Yeah.
But I'll just say compliance with RFS, hard.
Really hard.
Okay, just the amount of reporting requirements you have, it's hard. And the attitude of the EPA, which as I've personally discovered, from the enforcement, is combative, not cooperative. So California LCFS, much easier to get registered, much easier to figure out what your how to keep track of credits. The only negative about it is this quarterly
Is
monetization.
it just very similar to RFS too, as far as how it's, I guess, structured?
There's no rules on separation.
No rules on
No,
separation.
you know, once the producer, and it's the way RFS should have been too, really.
Yeah.
There should not have been all this crazy separation. The producer should have been able to create the credit, and then there'd be one point of enforcement, but then it wouldn't be as exciting as it is.
With the low carbon, that price is just for feedstocks, right? That credit is for feedstocks?
No, it only applies to the finished biodiesel
Mm-hmm.
or finished ethanol.
So let's say I'm a California plant, I'm trucking in used cooking oil from Arizona. What happens there?
So it's okay to bring in used cooking oil from Arizona. You just have to make sure you get registered correctly with what your primary feedstock streams are and your
the
primary
producer.
mechanism for getting your product to market. There's no restraint in the low carbon fuel standard on where the biodiesel is made. It's just that if you make it in Maine and ship it, it's obviously going to have a more carbon intensity than if you make it in California and sell it in California. If you sell it outside of California, it has no relevance. It only applies to fuel distributed in the state of California.
That's cool.
Does the LCFS make a distinction between different types of virgin feedstocks? Like, for instance, if you're talking
Yes,
soy versus
canola scores and camelina scores much better. Bentley's is in the process of getting registered for camelina under the low carbon fuel standard. But canola is kind of the catch-all for camelina too right now. Oh, well, I kind of used up my time. IRS, there's both Tax-related issues, of course, you've got, when you sell biodiesel, you've got federal tax if you sell it retail. If you don't sell it retail, you almost never deal with federal tax. The only time you deal with that is when you're selling retail. And then, of course, credits. Now, to get credits on the IRS, there's also a registration, and it's basically what's called a blender's license. To get that, you actually have to have what's called a FARS registration, which is also a prerequisite for RFS 2 registration. The FARS registration is also administered by the EPA, and that registration is the first registration that all biodiesel producers get, typically. And it basically it enables them to get the blender's credit, and it enables them to apply for the RFS. Doesn't get them RFS registration, but allows them to apply for the RFS. Of course, there's state level requirements. There's state road tax requirements, and some states, as in the case of this case, have carbon accounting requirements too. Where we are just, our company is just under the number of gallons that we would need to have to report gallons to a different part of state of California in terms of carbon emissions. But many people do have to. Then the EPA has something called the Toxic Substances Control Act, and they decided to include biodiesel, even though it's non-toxic in that. And it has to be done annually, and if you don't report, you still have that same $10,000 a day fine. Technically, I don't think that they would do that for a biodiesel producer who forgot to update his annual report. You should look at the National Biodiesel Board's website. They have a section on this particular compliance requirement as well. And then there's federal CO2 reporting that, depending again on the volume, most small producers will not have to deal with this.
What's the trigger?
And may not have to deal with this either.
What's a trigger ballpark?
I think it's about on the order of 1 million gallons a year.
Okay.
In terms of the carbon, it's about 22 pounds per gallon, so I think it's 22 million pounds, or about whatever that means in tons, 22,000 tons a year. So that's a quick overview. I went through all of them. Now I want to take a few minutes and just explain what's new in the last year. These two are both new requirements that the EPA has placed on businesses. These have been around forever. This has been around forever. This has been around also for a long time. Low carbon fuel standard has been around for a couple years, but now it's finally getting stable. And one element of the new low carbon fuel standard that's a significant improvement is that there's now an online tool for the transactions of the carbon credits. It was just some really stupid paper form that until just a few months ago you'd have to fill out, and it was a recipe for disaster in terms of compliance and potential fraud. But now that you have to actually register your transactions, it allows the state of California to keep track of, okay, well, how could you have sold that many credits? You didn't have that many credits to sell. So they're doing that basic checking. And then the big thing that's new under the Renewable Fuel Standard is something called QAP. And QAP stands for Quality Assurance Plan. One of the things that happened with all the RIN fraud is that obligated parties and traders, I would say traders more so than obligated parties, were responsible to a significant degree in creating this situation where, hey, sell me RINs, sell me RINs, sell me RINs. I got a buyer over here, sell me RINs, sell me RINs. And the traders were like, they didn't care. They thought, I'm just a middleman. If the RINs are fraudulent, not fraudulent, we just want to buy and sell RINs, buy and sell RINs, buy and sell RINs. And so what happened is that two people had very blatant cases of fraud that were easy to kind of decipher, okay, as fraud. And so what happened is that they were both small, no-name companies, so then all small companies became likely fraudsters. So it was very hard to sell RINs, for small producers to sell RINs. or to get any value, even for another company to accept RINs from that small producer, because that RINs are garbage as far as the market was concerned. So the EPA began working on it. The NBB participated in panel discussions, with the EPA to come up with a proposed solution. And QAP of having quality assurance plant was that solution. Basically, now to create a whole nother group of companies, third parties who come in to small companies who've got lots of money and the ability to pay for more overhead. That's a joke, in case you didn't get it. To hire these third parties to certify their RINs. And so typical compliance cost for a small producer to sign up to a QAP program is around $15,000 a year. But the argument is that, well, if RINs are worth $1.50, that's, or let's say they're worth at least $1, then is it worth to spend $15,000 a year if you're going to make 100,000 gallons in a year? And the answer is probably yes. What the third-party independent validator of your RINs does is he comes in and looks at, or she comes in and looks at everything about your operation. Where do you buy your feedstock? Where does your finished product get sold? And provides either one of two levels of assurance. And one's called a B level and the other one's called a level. The A level is a higher value assurance and can cost even more money, more like $20,000 a year. And the advantage of it, though, is that if a end user somehow in the future decides that RIN was a bad RIN,